What's the last thing that goes through someone's mind when they know they won't see the sun rise again? The question seems simple, but it cuts deep. Because it's not about words, but the weight they carry when there's no tomorrow. Imagine a cold room, lit by lamps that don't heat. The silence there isn't peace, it's a sentence. You hear only irregular breathing, as if each breath were stolen from time. A man, or a woman, is about to speak for the last time. And when the mouth opens, it's not just a voice that escapes. It's a confession. It's a wound. It's something that should never be heard. And that's where everything breaks down. Because it doesn't matter if you believe in justice, forgiveness, or guilt. Faced with the final words of someone sentenced to death, what truly matters isn't the crime. It's the abyss that reveals itself within the human mind. And perhaps you've felt it even without realizing it, that icy chill you get when you hear something you can't forget. Have you ever experienced this? Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself sitting across from this condemned man. He looks directly at you as if you were the only confidant capable of bearing the weight of the secret. There are no more lawyers, no more witnesses, no audience. Just the two of you. And the question that echoes, what would you say if you knew every word would be your last? But what you're about to discover may surprise you. Because among all the crimes, among all the executions, some last words weren't prayers, they were revelations. Some weren't regrets, they were accusations. And others, many others, were so disturbing they seemed more like a riddle cast to haunt the living. Do you see how this changes everything? The psychological impact isn't just in what they did, but in what they chose to leave behind. It's as if they used their last seconds not to free themselves, but to further imprison those who listened. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable truth. Sometimes those who die bring peace, but leave hell for those who remain. And it's at this point that the line between victim and perpetrator begins to blur. Because listening to a killer in their final moments can awaken something strange within us. Empathy? Fear? Guilt? Maybe a little of each. The psychological voyeurism that keeps us hooked on these cases isn't just morbid curiosity. It's the need to understand how far the human mind can go when cornered by its own mortality. But be careful. Because the deeper you delve, the more you realize those final words weren't just loose phrases. They were maps, codes, buried secrets that still breathe. It wasn't me can mean innocence or manipulation. A forgive me can be a cover for something even more cruel. And a simple whisper can completely change the way we view the crime, the victim, and even ourselves. This is where the thread breaks, and where the pain begins to make sense. Because every last sentence is an open door to a place you might not want to enter. But it's already too late. You've already started listening. And what comes next is just the surface of what is hidden. What if I told you that what you've heard so far is just a whisper of what's yet to come? Because the truth is that there are confessions that never came to light, stories so heavy that they were buried in dusty archives. And it is here in this space that they gain a voice again. But for this darkness to continue to be revealed, I need you. When you subscribe to this channel, it's not just a click. It's like lighting a candle inside a dark cell. It's what keeps the search for these forbidden secrets alive. It's what gives new stories their breath. Have you ever felt that strange need to understand what shouldn't be understood? To look into the dark side of the human mind without looking away? Then you know you're not alone. Here, there's a community of people who also share this restlessness, this hunger for mysteries that never quite close. Subscribe now and stay with me. Because what you'll discover in the next stories may be even more disturbing than you imagined. And remember, what's been revealed so far is just the surface. What lies beneath still breathes. Have you ever noticed how the silence before an ending can be more disturbing than the ending itself? There, in the seconds before the execution, time seems to stretch out until it becomes a maze. Hearts beat erratically, sweat drips even in a freezing cold room. The condemned man doesn't just think about death. He thinks about everything he never said, about everything he tried to hide, about everything that could still hurt more than the sentence itself. It's at this moment that the mind becomes a battleground. Between regret and pride, between the need for redemption and the temptation to cast a final shadow over the living. Can you imagine the weight of that? The feeling of carrying a secret so dense that even on the verge of disappearing, it still finds the strength to survive in the memory of those who listen? An old case illustrates well how this chasm works. Decades ago, a man walked to the electric chair with a stride far too steady for someone on the brink of death. There were no tears, no supposed confession. What existed was an almost insulting calm, as if he were about to surrender not his life, but a riddle. When finally asked what his last words would be, he smiled, and said something no one in that room has forgotten. "You're about to kill the wrong man." The phrase echoed like a curse. And it continues to echo to this day. Because after all, was it truth or manipulation? Behind the scenes of justice, this statement became an uncomfortable shadow. Investigators revisited evidence, journalists raised contradictions, and the collective mind was tainted by doubt. The psychological impact lay not only in the possible error, but in the fact that a definitive answer was never reached. Was it a hidden truth or just a final ploy by a culprit accustomed to distorting reality? And here's the most uncomfortable part. When someone sentenced to death plants a seed of uncertainty, that seed doesn't die with them. It spreads. It generates debates, revolts, even theories that challenge the official version. The transformation doesn't happen in the cell, but in the minds of everyone who came into contact with that sentence. And perhaps that's why, to this day when we talk about this case, the question isn't about the execution itself, but about what it left behind. Have you ever imagined yourself in the place of someone who heard those words up close? Would you trust justice or would you start to doubt it? What if you were the one carrying that doubt for the rest of your life? This is the cruelty of certain revelations. They don't liberate, they imprison. Because doubt doesn't close cycles, it opens wounds. And no matter how many years pass, there are always those who whisper that perhaps the real killer remained free. Or worse, that the real victim was justice. But was that really it? Or was it all just a final act, staged by someone who knew that his last words would have more power than any evidence in court? Notice how the line between reality and interpretation blurs. Some contemporary records point to flaws in the process, false leads never investigated, and contradictory witnesses. Others, however, assert that there was no error whatsoever. And in the midst of this maze, the viewer, like you now, becomes hostage to the same dilemma that marked an entire generation. And this is where the mystery solidifies. Because even if they try to convince with reports, files, and official truths, there's always that inner voice that insists, what if it wasn't quite like that? And the most disturbing thing is realizing that this doubt isn't just a thing of the past. It lingers, seeps in, and still breathes today like an open scar, reminding us that truth can be as fragile as the mind of the person carrying it. And just when we think we've found an answer, a new gap appears. A forgotten detail. A contradictory testimony. A revelation that seems to transform everything again. That's when we understand, death ends a body but never ends a story. And this one still pulsates. Sometimes it's not the scream that remains, but the forgotten detail. A fragment too small to be noticed in the rush of justice, but large enough to erode certainties over the years. A crumpled handkerchief found in the convict's pocket, forgotten in official records. A common fabric of no apparent value, but stained. Not with blood. With something more banal, more intimate, perfume. The scent lingered even decades later, stored in the archives. A feminine, ancient fragrance, all too recognizable for anyone who lived through that time. And it was this detail, so fragile, so seemingly irrelevant, that created the first crack in the official story. Because in court there was always talk of brutality, raw violence, and hatred. But never of closeness, never of intimacy. The scarf conveyed another narrative. A layer that didn't match the portrait of a cold, distant killer. That's how the doubts began. Who owned that perfume? Why was the play never presented at trial? And, most disturbingly, could the crime have been motivated not just by impulse but by something deeper? Love, rejection, jealousy? When this clue came to light, the mindset of everyone involved changed. Suddenly, the case was no longer just about a culprit and a victim. It was about decisions made in the dark, behind-the-scenes stories hidden beneath the official version. It was about a relationship that might never have been revealed to the public, but that left invisible traces. And with that, the weight of the last sentence, "You're about to kill the wrong man," gained even more impact. Because what if he wasn't the only one involved? Little by little, the forgotten object became a catalyst. A simple piece of fabric, yet capable of opening doors no one wanted to cross. People began revisiting old letters, torn photographs, hastily filed testimonies. And the more they looked, the more they realized how much truth was a shadow shattered into pieces. But the handkerchief wasn't just proof, it was also provocation. Because he didn't answer anything. He just increased the emptiness. Each revelation brought new questions, and the feeling that something was wrong with the whole process. A hidden truth, purposely kept silent. Imagine being one of the victim's relatives and discovering years later that there was a detail never revealed. That might have changed the course of the sentence. That might have pointed to someone completely different. The psychological impact is not just the crime, but the destruction of trust. It is in this abyss that the mind gets lost, to believe what was said or to make room for what was hidden. And here the controversy intensifies. Because some say the handkerchief meant nothing, that it was just a coincidence. A distraction created by those who wanted to reopen old wounds. But there are also those who swear that the object, purposefully forgotten, was the key, and that the decision to ignore it was conscious. A choice to quickly end a process full of shadows. Do you realize the cruelty of this? The condemned man could no longer defend himself. Death had silenced him. But the handkerchief remained. A mute but eloquent body. And like every ghost, he wouldn't rest. He continued to haunt the corridors of collective memory, reminding us that nothing is as simple as it seems. Perhaps this is what bothers me most. The idea that a piece of cloth could carry more truth than an entire courtroom. That the transformation of an entire case's narrative could depend on something that could fit in one's pocket. And if a forgotten handkerchief can become a game changer, what else has been overlooked? The answer is unclear. Because shortly after this revelation, another detail emerged. One even more disturbing, and one that not only questioned the sentence but the very sense of justice that had sustained the case until then. What seemed forgotten would change everything, but what came next was even darker. The most disturbing thing isn't the monster lurking in the alleys, but the familiar silence that hid its breath for years. The enemy wasn't coming from outside. He was already inside the house, mingling with the routine, sitting at the same table, sharing the same bread. He was someone too ordinary to be suspected, too invisible to raise doubts. And it was precisely this invisibility that allowed the horror to thrive unnoticed. When the truth finally began to emerge, it didn't come with explosions or shouted revelations. It came in layers, almost like dust accumulating on old furniture. First, it was the neighbors, remembering small details that had always seemed banal. The door locked too early, the muffled sounds in the night, the glances that shied away from direct contact. Then, the children themselves, rummaging through old drawers, finding hidden letters, fragments of diaries that didn't seem to make sense, until they began to connect. Imagine the psychological rupture of discovering that the figure you were supposed to protect was also the source of your pain. The transformation doesn't happen all at once. First, the mind rejects, then it resists, until finally it accepts, but fragmentedly, with guilt, anger, and a kind of grief that never finds rest. The family's mentality was shattered. Because how can one live with the certainty that someone so close carried a hidden truth, carefully concealed behind everyday gestures? Behind the scenes of the investigation, the police reported the same feeling, that they were invading a life that seemed all too normal. Photographs of parties, laughter frozen in frames. A simple backyard, carefully planted flowers. And, alongside it all, the undeniable evidence of a crime that had destroyed everything. The impact was not just the act itself, but the chasm between public image and private secret. What was revealed was not just a killer, but the collapse of trust built over years. This dissonance corroded everyone involved. Neighbors began to view each other with suspicion. Children began to question childhood memories. Was that hug genuine or just a facade? And the wife, who shared his bed for decades, was forced to confront the question she never found an answer to. Did she know, and chose to ignore it, or was she as much a victim as the others? It's in this gray space that true terror takes hold. Because it's not just about a culprit. It's about decisions, small choices that accumulate in everyday life, until they create a wall of silence around the truth. Fragmented revelations showed that the killer was no outsider. He was routine. He was normality. And that's much more disturbing. The cruelest thing is realizing that the execution itself, that final ritualized scene before the cold gaze of justice, didn't bring closure. Quite the opposite. It opened fissures that never closed. Because, seconds before dying, the condemned man didn't beg for forgiveness or declare his innocence. He simply murmured a name. A name no one expected to hear. A name that belonged to someone still alive. That stray detail, that almost lost whisper, sent the family into meltdown. Because it wasn't just about the man who was now dead. Maybe there was another. Maybe the story had never been complete. Maybe, within that seemingly peaceful house, something even darker still lingered, breathing silently. What seemed like a definitive discovery became just another layer of uncertainty. And just when everyone thought they had finally found the answers, another ghost rose from the shadows. Something no one was prepared to face, something even more sinister. And perhaps that's why this story isn't confined within the prison walls or the tomb of that condemned man. Because deep down, it also touches something deep within us. That gnawing doubt that whispers, what if it had been someone from my home? What if the enemy had worn the same smile that comforts me today? This is the wound that never heals. This is where I need to invite you to leave a mark. Not like someone commenting on a random video, but like someone leaving a fragment of yourself in the middle of this labyrinth. Write a word in the comments. Just one. The one that came to mind while listening to this story. It could be fear. It could be truth. It could be the name of someone you can't forget. This matters. More than you might think. Because each comment is a record of someone who also feels this unease. It's proof that we're not alone in our quest to understand what will never be fully explained. And it's also a way to keep this space alive so these stories can continue to be told without forced silence. So write. Vent. Let your words echo alongside the others. And notice how, when united, they create an invisible chorus. A community that exists precisely in the unsaid, the forbidden, in what most pretend not to see. And perhaps, amidst these words, another clue emerges. A forgotten detail. Something that, as always, wasn't where we expected it, but that changes everything. The past never completely buries itself. It breathes. Sometimes it whispers. Other times it screams in the silence of any given dawn. And just when we think we know every face, every name, another shadow appears, a forgotten victim, a life ripped away as coldly as one would pluck a useless object from an old drawer. What should have been just another number in the statistics begins to take shape, a smell, a face. And this shape isn't neutral, it weighs. It weighs like guilt. It weighs like a question that never finds an answer. The condemned man facing death row didn't just carry the weight of his decisions. He carried the gaze of every person who believed they were safe and who, nevertheless, was touched by the trail he left. The psychological impact is what doesn't fit into the court records. There's no report that explains the terror of opening a door and feeling that someone has been there before, that something has been violated without a sound. It's this silent transformation, from normality to paranoia, that is more destructive than the violence itself. Revelations began to accumulate like small cracks in an old wall. A detail in the testimony. A banal object found in a forgotten box. A habit that seemed innocent but, in retrospect, becomes unbearably suspicious. The killer didn't just appear at a crime scene. He reappeared in everyday gestures, in memories that would previously have gone unnoticed. As if the enemy had never left home. As if, even imprisoned, he still occupied the most intimate space of the mind. And perhaps that's why each new victim discovered didn't feel like a complete revelation, but like an echo. An echo of something bigger, deeper, that had yet to be told. The shock came not only from what was discovered, but from the silence that followed. Because silence is the true accomplice. It's in it that ghosts breathe. The mentality that allowed that horror didn't emerge suddenly. It was built, layer by layer, until the boundary between the normal and the monstrous dissolved. An invisible but devastating transformation. It is in this murky space that the hidden truth lurks. Not in the act itself but behind the scenes of the mind. In the preparation. In the intimate rehearsal of a cruelty that seemed impossible, until it became routine. This is where I need you to pay attention. Stay with me until the end. Because it's there and only there that a detail that seems irrelevant now will click. And when it does, it will change the way you look at everything you've heard so far. Each new victim also brought a false sense of relief. As if the list had come to an end. As if the past had been completely mapped out. But what happened next was always more disturbing. Because it wasn't just the number of lives, but the feeling that his presence never left the scene. Like a cold breath on the back of the neck even when no one was in the room. And so, while everyone believed they were nearing the end, something subtle made it clear that the game wasn't over yet. That there was a shadow that insisted on remaining, even when everything indicated it should be dead. The illusion of normality is always the cruelest. Because it isn't born in the darkness of a cell or in the empty gaze of a monster that reveals itself immediately. It grows on quiet streets, at Sunday lunches, in gestures so commonplace that no one would ever dare suspect them. He knew this, and he explored every detail like someone writing a silent script, where the audience is deceived without realizing it. In the neighborhood, he was the man who greeted with a smile. The father who drove his children to school. The worker who never missed a shift. Every movement was calculated to appear transparent, every decision honed to avoid suspicion. Transforming into a facade required discipline. And paradoxically, it was in this guise of normalcy that the true abyss lay hidden. The impact of this isn't measured only when the crime is revealed. The impact begins earlier, the moment you discover that the person you let into your home carried something so dark inside. It's the breach of trust that bleeds the most, not the act itself. Because crime steals not only a life but also a sense of security, the belief in what seems stable. The trail it left wasn't just violence, it was disorientation. Behind the scenes of his routine, there were two overlapping versions. The first was the public, social one, carefully constructed to maintain his disguise. The second was secret, fueled by thoughts that ran like shadows in his mind, increasingly intense, increasingly impossible to contain. It is in this invisible border that the hidden truth resides, the slow construction of a false persona until it merges with the real one. Those who knew him tell banal stories. How he helped carry bags. How he smiled at birthday parties. How he seemed to care. And it is precisely in this contrast that the controversy arises. How many monsters have you greeted without knowing it? How many secrets can fit in a smile? Doubt is corrosive because it gives way to paranoia. Suddenly anyone can be. Any silence can hide. And when the crimes finally came to light, the shock wasn't just in what he did, but in what everyone failed to see. It wasn't obvious brutality, but the subtlety of a mindset capable of putting on a convincing show for years. The fragmented revelations revealed not only the victims, but the settings in which he managed to camouflage himself. Family barbecues, ordinary dinners, the routine of a neighborhood where no one suspected. This chasm between appearance and truth is what's most deeply disturbing. Because it forces each person to ask themselves, what if it were me? What if that nice neighbor who greets me every morning was hiding something? What if the person sharing my bed had a secret I'd never dare imagine? This question doesn't close, it finds no answer, it just repeats itself like an echo. In his mind, seconds before his execution, this duality seemed to emerge violently. The man in the shadows and the hidden monster faced each other for the last time. One trying to justify himself, the other remembering every detail. The regret was diffuse, not for what he had done but for having been discovered. And in his eyes, an almost imperceptible trace of pride. As if the true triumph hadn't been the crime, but the ability to deceive everyone for so long. And for years he did deceive. He deceived neighbors, co-workers, family members. He even fooled those who slept next to him, believing they knew every part of his life. The contrast between what seemed and what was real left invisible scars. Because it's not just about dealing with death, but with the realization that normality can be the most perfect mask for horror. And it's at this point that the narrative thread becomes tense again, because the illusion never shatters completely. It leaves fragments, loose pieces that insist on remaining. As if the facade had never completely disappeared. As if there were still something hidden behind the smile everyone swore was genuine. The trap didn't begin with sirens or handcuffs. It was a tiny detail. An oversight that, to anyone else, would seem trivial. But to him, it was the crack that let the darkness escape. A poorly stored letter. A forgotten file at the bottom of a drawer. A word written in a tone that didn't match the rehearsed version. Small flaws invisible to the naked eye, but together forming a crack. And through that crack, the hidden truth began to breathe. The impact wasn't immediate. At first, it seemed like mere coincidence. A technical detail that could easily be explained away. But the closer you looked, the more fragile normality seemed, like a wall painted to hide deep cracks. The mentality that had kept him protected crumbled not in the face of a brilliant researcher, but in the face of the very weight of the decisions he'd made. It was as if he'd left breadcrumbs along the way, and those crumbs silently pointed back to him. This fragmented revelation shattered not only his facade but also the trust of those who swore they knew him. Because it wasn't just the crime that was hidden there, but the transformation of an ordinary man into someone capable of staging an entire life while nursing an inner abyss. Behind the scenes of the process, every forgotten detail became a weapon. Every contradiction revealed layers he thought he'd buried forever. Silence, once complicit, now spoke louder than any confession. And yet there was something strange. As if the mistake wasn't just an accident, but almost a necessity. A part of him seemed to want to be found. Perhaps from the fatigue of sustaining two existences. Perhaps from the secret desire to expose his distorted work to everyone, as if the crime were an invisible signature he wanted to be recognized. This ambiguity is disturbing because it reveals a paradox. Did he fall through carelessness or because his mind was already begging to be revealed? As the investigation progressed, intimate details began to emerge, like stains that could no longer be erased. The forgotten file was not only evidence, but also an indirect confession. A window into his mind. A glimpse behind the scenes where violence was revealed not with screams, but with cold calculations. Each revelation eroded the public image he had built. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors had to face the truth. Everything they thought they knew was nothing more than an act. The psychological impact of this was devastating. Not only for the immediate victims but for everyone around them. Normalcy would never be the same again. How could one trust again after discovering that years of coexistence were built on a lie? This is the kind of pain that never heals. Because there's no going back to the naivete of before. Once you look at the hidden face, it's still there even in silence. And then there were the false leads, intentional or not, that further confused those seeking to understand. Some letters seemed to have been written by someone else. Certain files showed contradictory dates. It was as if a deliberate game was underway, a manipulation that mixed reality and interpretation. Even the investigators were uncertain. What was true? What was a distraction? This uncertainty made the process even denser, more suffocating. The condemned man, facing execution, carried this same duality in his gaze. A flash of irony, as if he knew there were still buried secrets. That not all the answers had been given. That some truths would die with him. And perhaps this would be his ultimate triumph. Leaving behind not only the weight of his crimes, but also the lingering doubt, the feeling that something had always escaped him. The error that betrayed him seemed like an inevitable end. But deep down, it was only the opening of an even greater abyss. Because each revelation brought no relief, only more questions. Each answer created new fissures, as if the truth were a maze with no exit. And in the midst of this maze, there remained the nagging feeling that the worst had yet to be told. The silence inside that house wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a weight that crushed the chest of anyone who dared listen. Every footstep echoed as if awakening ancient ghosts, every object became an accomplice to a secret that should never have existed. And then betrayal arose from where one would least expect. He wasn't a stranger in the dead of night, nor an overly curious neighbor. He was someone so close that he knew every laugh, every habit, every fear. A son, a daughter, a spouse, someone who had shared nights and mornings, meals and birthdays, becoming the involuntary guardian of an illusory normality that was now crumbling. The horror gained depth because it penetrated intimacy. It was no longer just the crime, no longer just the monster hidden behind the facade of an ordinary citizen. It was the abyss that had opened in the hearts of those who loved, in the trust placed in bonds believed unbreakable. Every look, every gesture, every word spoken in years gone by began to be reread with suspicion and fear. The human mind contorts at the possibility that those we trust most might hide truths that tear us apart. It's a slow, corrosive effect that consumes our perception of reality and pushes us to the brink of permanent doubt. And there he was, conscious, almost playing with the fracture he had created. The killer, with his almost ironic calm, seemed to observe the reaction of those who now had the power to expose what he had kept silent for years. The transformation of the common man into something monstrous did not end with his crimes. It was completed in the way he manipulated affection, how he shaped expectations, how he fed on the illusion of normality to hide his true nature. It is the most silent perversity, not the act itself but the manipulation of perception, the control of other people's reality until each fissure becomes irreversible. Decisions that had seemed trivial for years now emerged like pieces on a chessboard he himself had created. A misspoken word, a strayed glance, a rejected touch, every intimate gesture became part of a macabre mosaic that pointed to the hidden truth. And deep down, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible pleasure in seeing the behind-the-scenes of his own work being uncovered from the inside out. There was no need for explanations. Every detail, every revelation carried its own psychological weight. What was familiar now provoked unease. A once ordinary family dinner became a tense scene. Every laugh hid a shadow. Every touch could be a memory or a threat. The minds of those close to them, especially their children, began to decipher signals that had previously gone unnoticed but now took on a disturbing clarity. Trust, once solid, shattered into 1,000 invisible fragments. And even when the killer's minor error seemed to have triggered the exposure, the truth that emerged was only partial. Every document revisited, every letter found, every recording or intimate memory became a clue and a trap at the same time. Questions arose, some nearly impossible to answer. Who knew? Who suspected? Who had already noticed but remained silent? The manipulation of perception continued, this time with the family itself as the unwitting protagonist. Yet, while everyone else was trying to piece things together, the condemned man maintained an almost artistic control over what would become public. His mind, even in the final seconds before facing his execution, was still racing through strategies, anticipating the impact of the discoveries, predicting the emotional fissures that would open, fueling the psychological voyeurism of those who followed his every move. What had seemed like a mere investigation now became a silent spectacle, where horror and empathy intertwined inseparably. And it is at this point that one realizes, if even blood ties betray, if even the closest love becomes a revelation, then what remains of humanity in this silence? The question seeks no immediate answer, because the answer dissolves in the very intensity of doubt. Each fragment of lost trust, each memory now tainted by fear and suspicion, creates an unresolved tension. Horror takes hold not in spectacular acts, but in corrupted intimacy, in everyday life invaded by the impossible. Meanwhile, on the surface, everything continues as if nothing had happened. The home remains, the walls retain their colors, the furniture retains its shape, and life continues with a normality that only exists on the surface. But behind this facade, every detail discovered, every betrayal, every hidden truth begins to breathe on its own, amplifying the psychological impact of the crime. Revelations that seemed isolated now interconnect, forming a web of tension that spreads to everyone who shares the space. And at the center of this web is him, the condemned man whose transformation, decisions, and mindset do not end with the discovery. Every human gesture, every emotional reaction of those close to him, fuels the echo of terror. The home, the family, the daily routine, everything becomes a stage for the silent escalation of truth, for the psychological impact that only those who observe closely can fully understand. Every step taken by those who once trusted him brings them closer to an abyss that is not only legal but also moral and emotional. And even when it seems an end is in sight, that the exposure has been enough to bring order to the chaos, the feeling remains that something greater still lurks in the shadows. As if each revealed detail were merely a fragment of an even deeper secret, something that surpasses immediate comprehension and leaves an indelible mark on the minds of those who observe, on the bodies of those who feel, and on the story that unfolds with a rhythm that blends reality and interpretation, keeping everyone on silent alert, waiting for more. And as we continue to peel back these layers, there's something you need to understand. It's not just about observing. It's about participating, feeling together, noticing every crack that silence hides. Stay with me until the end. Because every detail you see here is just the surface, and to discover what truly hides behind these walls, you need to stay here with me. If you feel the weight of this story, if curiosity throbs in your chest, then you know we're not just telling you facts. We're creating a space where your every thought matters, your every question resonates. By subscribing, you're not just clicking a button. You're ensuring this narrative continues, that every secret, every hidden truth, every psychological impact is explored to its very last shadow. The continuity of this channel depends on those who truly want to understand the forbidden, who feel the inner unease, who want to walk through fear safely, but filled with reflection and empathy. Each video, each revelation, each point of tension only makes sense because you are here, attentive, breathing along. Your presence is part of what keeps this story alive. And even now, when everything seems close to a conclusion, know this: there is more, much more hidden behind the scenes waiting to emerge. If you want to truly feel the depth of what happens behind every facade, behind every silence, you must be here with me until the end. Because only then will the human mind be confronted with the true dimension of terror and corrupted intimacy, and you will see what many have never dared to face. Stay with me until the end, and you will not only witness, but understand what makes each secret as devastating as it is irresistible. Each step forward promises revelations no one has told before, and you will realize that being here is more than curiosity. It is allowing yourself to look into the eyes of hidden truth. The silence falls heavy, almost solid. And even with the gates closed, with the familiar face of justice plastered across the newspapers, something still pulses beneath the surface. It's as if every locked door, every suspicious look, every partial confession were just another fragment of a mind that refuses to be silent. You feel it, don't you? The discomfort of knowing that the end they gave you may not be the real one, that there's a shadow creeping behind the apparent light. He's trapped. He's exposed. Is he dead? Maybe. But every forgotten detail, every bone never found, every testimony lost in bureaucracy or fear continues to echo. The killer's mind, even now, continues to pulse within the walls, and you realize it's not just curiosity. It's a need to understand, to feel the weight of what justice doesn't always reach. You want to know, you want to feel every moment before the final silence, you want to traverse the corridors of the human mind and touch the abyss hidden behind a smile, a banal gesture. Imagine the routine he built, each carefully crafted lie, each face he touched without anyone knowing the poison within. And then the discovery, the veiled complicity, the ignored signs, the small mistakes that became evident, but still leave questions hanging. Who else knew? Who covered it up? Who chose to turn a blind eye to what was right in front of them? You feel the unease building inside you, the shiver that won't go away because you know the truth is never complete. And even when imprisonment becomes inevitable, when the world believes he's finally contained, you begin to perceive the fissure. The doubt. Remains of victims missing, messages never delivered, files erased, promises of silence that death failed to keep. Every detail that seemed like an end now becomes the beginning of reflection. The true horror, perhaps, was never revealed. And you sense, that something bigger, darker, still lurks between the lines, behind the scenes of the story you follow with bated breath. Meanwhile, you perceive the psychological construct that held everything together, the facade of normalcy, the moments of affection that masked the monster. The transformation he imposed on each life, the silent impact of decisions no one dared question, the hidden truth that continues to move even after exposure. You can almost hear his breathing, slow, calculated, imagining your every step, every reaction he provoked without anyone noticing. And you feel empathy, pain, fear, curiosity, all mixed together because it's impossible to separate the human from the monstrous when you look too closely. And it is here, on this threshold between what has been revealed and what remains buried, that you understand. The end is never absolute. The outcome that society accepts as finished is only a layer, and beneath it lie echoes, traces, shadows that will not dissipate. Every forgotten piece of evidence, every complicit silence, every lie told to protect normalcy now becomes a clue, a provocation, a reminder of what can never be fully explained. You feel like you know the story, but at the same time, you realize there's still much to unravel. The line between reality and imagination blurs, and you wonder, does the true horror lie in the facts we know, or in the gaps we dare not fill? The answers the human mind seeks are countless, and the need to understand is more intense than any fear we might feel. Then you realize that being here, following every detail, every layer, is more than just watching. It's becoming an accomplice to your own understanding. It's walking through the silent corridors of the human mind, touching the impact of decisions, and feeling the transformation they provoke in every life affected. And even now, when everything seems contained, doubt remains, creeping through the shadows. Perhaps the truth will never be complete, perhaps the true horror will never be uncovered. But you are here, breathing along, feeling every fissure, every space of silence, every point where justice failed or fell short. And as all this unfolds, you realize that what you feel is not just a fascination with the forbidden, but also a need to understand what makes us both human and monstrous. You observe, question, feel. Every fragment, every detail, every absence carries a weight that doesn't dissipate, and you know that the ending that seems to close the story is nothing more than an invitation to look deeper, to hear what the shadows still whisper. And it's in that moment, when the world thinks everything is resolved, that you realize, perhaps the true horror has yet to be uncovered. That there are voices yet to be heard, details yet to be touched, secrets that remain hidden, waiting for someone, perhaps you, to get close enough to feel the full impact. It's an almost palpable tension, one that never lets up, because the human mind is never satisfied with absolute endings. And so, you remain there, conscious, restless, connected. Knowing that the story isn't over, that each fragment uncovered is just another step toward something we don't yet fully understand. The abyss remains open, and you realize that being attentive, feeling every emotion, every silence, every lie revealed, is part of an invisible pact. A pact that says true horror doesn't reveal itself all at once. That it seeps in, slowly, until you find yourself looking within yourself, questioning your limits, your certainties, your own ability to judge. And as the final curtain of normality falls, you feel its presence, the hidden monster, even when prison or death seem to have served justice. It lingers in the forgotten fragments, in the shadows that have not been illuminated, in the stories never told. And you realize with a deep shiver that this feeling, this unease, is the true continuity of the narrative. An ending that doesn't close, an echo that resonates through time, reminding you that the horror, the impact, the transformation, still breathe, invisible but tangible, waiting for those who dare to feel it. The silence weighs like lead. You realize that even with the bodies counted, even with the doors locked and the archives sealed, there's something that keeps moving, invisible, imperceptible but present. An echo that doesn't fade, that seeps into the cracks of time, into abandoned houses, into eyes that turn away in fear of what they don't want to remember. It's his trail, of what he left behind, of the decisions he made, of the hidden truths no one dared to face. And you sense, deep down, that this isn't just about crime, justice, or punishment. It's about the effect that evil, even hidden, leaves on the minds of everyone who breathes the same air, who walks the same hallways, who sleeps under the same roofs. He was there, as close as you, as invisible as the secrets we keep, and his every gesture was calculated to leave traces that would only be revealed much later. You think of the victims, the families, the stories interrupted, and feel a pang of collective guilt, because we all, in some way, closed our eyes to what seemed too small, too banal, or too distant. And meanwhile, every forgotten detail, every fading memory, every complicit silence becomes a layer of this spiral that never closes. It's curious to realize how time doesn't erase everything. The DNA of what happened still breathes, still speaks, still manifests itself in small fissures. In forgotten objects, in houses no one wants to visit, in memories that refuse to fade. You can almost hear the echoes of footsteps that were never noticed, feel the shivers of a gaze that pierced walls and hearts, touch the presence of something that was always there, even when the world thought it was over. And you realize you're inside something bigger than a crime story, you're inside the transformation that a single mind capable of so much horror can generate. Every decision, every gesture, every carefully constructed lie reverberates in layers that overlap, multiply, and bring you uncomfortably close to the abyss. It's a shared consciousness and intimacy you didn't ask for but now you can't ignore. You feel fear, empathy, repulsion, and fascination all at once, because the line between the human and the monstrous dissolves right before your eyes. And then you begin to perceive the behind the scenes that no one sees. The spectator's safe fear isn't just entertainment, it's a lens through which you observe human frailties, the choices that shape destinies, the secrets we carry and that define us without us realizing it. You feel you understand what hides behind the smile, the trivial gesture, the seemingly innocent routine. Every small mistake, every detail that slipped through, every shadow that was left behind, all of this makes up a narrative that refuses to close. And it's in that moment that you feel the true depth of the impact. It's not just about the death, the crime, the exposure. It's about how horror infiltrates memories, the spaces we inhabit, the stories we tell ourselves to sleep at night. It's about the guilt we carry for not realizing it sooner, the tension that won't dissolve, the regret that arises when we imagine, what if it were me? The spiral partially closes, but the feeling of incompleteness remains, pulsing silently, insistently, almost alive. Stay with me until the end, and not just for what you'll see but for what you'll feel. Because what lies ahead isn't just a revelation, it's an immersion into what breathes between the lines of history, into what remains hidden even after the last sealed file, the last recorded confession. It's an invitation to look deeper, to feel what lurks in the silence and in the details most ignore, but which transform everything you think you know about human limits, morality, the impact of decisions and kept secrets. Even when imprisonment, death, or exposure seem to have ended the story, you realize it lives on, in fragments of memory, in empty houses, in memories that return like insistent whispers. And you feel, more than you see, that the outcome was never complete. That there are traces, subtle traces, that persist. The horror, the transformation, the hidden truth, all continue to breathe, lurking, waiting for someone, perhaps you, to perceive what no one dared to see. And as you remain immersed in this abyss, you realize that the final echo is not silence. It is a spiral, a sigh that crosses time, a presence that insists on not being forgotten. You feel the weight of it, the pain of incompleteness, the chill of a story that never truly ends. Each layer revealed is merely an invitation to look deeper, to touch the fissures, to hear the silences that say more than any words. And it is in that moment that you understand that the story, though seemingly closed, still breathes within you, hinting that perhaps the true horror has never been uncovered. If you've made it this far, it means you've felt every step of this story, every silence, every shadow that crossed the mind of what seemed impossible. So leave a comment below. I'm with you until the end. It's a simple gesture, but it carries something deeper. You're acknowledging that you've entered this spiral with me, that you've understood that some truths aren't spoken, they're felt. If you felt this connection, leave a like. It's not just a gesture, it's a way of showing that you've grasped the weight of every decision, every secret, every lack of response. That you understand that justice, even when delayed, and truth, even when hidden, still resonate. And if you want to continue down this path, there's a video right here that complements everything we've just covered. It's worth going there, continuing to feel, discover, and question. Because this story, as you've noticed, doesn't end where the crime ends. It breathes in everything that was hidden, in every detail we insist on ignoring. Subscribe and stay with me, because what follows isn't just information, it's an experience. And every step you take with me, every discovery you share in the comments, strengthens this search for what the world prefers not to see. Following isn't just watching, it's understanding, feeling, and taking a stand in the face of what no one has dared to face. Now take a deep breath. Feel that tension that still lingers and follow me to the next video. There we'll touch on the layers that have been suspended here, revealing what few have dared to perceive. The spiral continues and you are at its center.